Hi
Yeah.
everyone. Hi everyone here. Hi everyone that's joining us on YouTube. Thanks for joining us again for another Future of Money episode, our second one of today, which is the first time we've done two in one day. So if you joined us for the first one, welcome back, and everyone that's joining us for the second one, welcome now. And as you know, today we're talking about a topic that's been in the news a lot recently, which is about cryptocurrency and their energy usage, hence why we've called it Can Crypto Go Green? As always, I am co-hosting with Alex. Hi, Alex.
Hi there. Hi, George. Hi, everyone.
So we are joined today by Jesse Phillips. Now, Jesse is Business Development Manager for Mining Pool at Binance. And we've actually been planning this event for quite a while with Jesse. It's not actually just because of last week's news stories that this has come about. It's something we've been talking about for a long time when we've done events with Santiago in the past. One of the questions that we've always said is, a lot of talk around cryptocurrency and particularly Bitcoin is its energy usage. So, is that sustainable? What does that mean for its place in the world, particularly as we transition to greener economies, hopefully? But Jesse is the person to answer all of those questions. So that's why he's with us today. Jesse, would you like to introduce yourself a little bit and tell us what you do?
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate, first off, the time to talk about this. It's one of my favorite subjects, and also I'm honored to be here. My background is primarily, I guess, in Bitcoin, blockchain, and all of that. I come from, deep expertise on the mining side. I've been working in this space since very, very early 2017, full time. And so one of my most like the things that drives me every day is the idea that Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining specifically, and crypto for that matter, that runs on proof of work, can not only be an answer, but I think the solution to climate change. So I've been talking about this all around the United States as well as the world for a couple of years now. Really started getting deeply into it in 2018. And I'm privileged at this point in my life to be working directly with many of the pioneers in the space on the mining side through my work at Binance Pool. So we aggregate hash rate, which is computational work from around the world. Basically, every corner of the world, we have clients. And so I kind of sit at a ground floor, which I think is a very privileged position in this space, to sit at the ground floor and see this transformation from really deep within the community. So I'm here today, to really share some of that information and hopefully shed a different light on what's actually happening on the ground, and how we can move forward as a greener world.
Oh, brilliant. And thanks for joining us, because we're really, really glad to have you here. So let's start with kind of looking at a broad picture of this. So if we were to transition to a world that was mainly using digital crypto-based currencies, how would that compare to the existing financial system?
That's a great question. I think fundamentally we have to go and look at the value of cryptocurrency, beyond just like getting deeply into the weeds with what Bitcoin means for the world. I think there are just a couple of points that we should hit on first and foremost. One of them being better transparency. So that's a facet of public ledgers, public, blockchains like Bitcoin, like Ethereum, like any of the other large-scale distributed networks. I think for people all around the world, as this is a global phenomenon, the control over their own money is a really important factor that kind of sits outside of the traditional banking system. And then I think something that Binance is very interested in, and myself I'm very interested in, is better access to finance for everyone. So if we look at the traditional fiat world, without even going into what that means on an environmental level, we look at a situation for the most part where people, based on inflation, are actively not incentivized to save. And what I mean by that is, if you look at kind of the inflation, if we take the US dollar, for example, if your inflation target is around 2% for the year, that means the value of your money next year is basically 2% less. And so one of the things that drives me every day is I think that we're quickly entering a situation where cryptocurrencies, for that matter, can be an incentive for regular people like you and I to save and to let their money work for them. And I think for a vast majority of the world that is either unbanked or underbanked or doesn't have access to things like liquidity and lending and all of that, crypto is the first time, and it is also the most democratized way that we've seen, at least in our lifetimes, I believe, that we can service those types of individuals. So on a purely financial level, I think that's what we would see is better transparency, control over your own money, and better access to finance for everyone. And I think those are highly important. And that is even before we step into the ideas of potentially a greener planet by not using legacy systems. I've talked a lot about this, especially on things like CoinDesk for Earth Day, but we often get this comparison of Bitcoin as an apples to apples to something like another payment processor like PayPal, Visa, MasterCard. Yeah. And that is a little bit of an issue because it doesn't quite touch on the entire truth of the matter. What we're looking at is simultaneously, it's the security of the network, right? So that's what proof of work is really doing, and we can go into that later. I'm sure we will here. It's the minting of basically in circulation of new currency, and finally, it's also the storage of that and the ledger. So we've got all of these facets of a monetary supply that are existing on a public blockchain that are upheld by regular people, and that are also cheaper in general to transfer outside of the banking system. So we have a real competitor here to the traditional banking system. And if you look at that and all of those facets on a blockchain like the Bitcoin network, we actually see, and this is backed up by a lot of data on, for example, on the Cambridge Bitcoin Energy Index. Galaxy Digital just published a new article. It actually ends up being quite a bit more green, right? We're not transporting money in Garda trucks. We're not printing new currency. We're not securing it behind, 2 foot thick steel vaults. We don't have to uphold this, Swift or any of those other computer systems. And we don't have, for example, ATMs that are switched every couple of years that end up as an environmental disaster in some part of the world where they're, where they need to be, quote, recycled. So those are just a couple of the facets that are all, taken care of when we look at a digital and crypto-based system when compared to the legacy, or I would say the fiat system currently.
All right. So, JC, before we go into let's just say the subject of the green economy, can we just start with, I think, the foundations? You said first, the proof of stake. We've been hearing, I've been reading a lot of things, especially few days, about cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin and everything. Can you tell us the difference between proof of work and proof of stake?
Sure. Yeah, it's a really important difference, and I think there's been a lot more emphasis. A little bit more emphasis in the news about proof of stake recently. A lot of new cryptocurrencies are coming out, and there's this idea that somehow running hardware, which we'll get into, is either bad or less interesting, at least at this point. The fundamental differences, though, are in the security and basically the consensus mechanisms. So these are just fundamentally two types of consensus mechanisms. One of them, pretty simply, is that I'm going to allocate a certain amount of computational power, which is very hard to spoof, and that's going to be my input into the network. So what that means is that if I input wrong, or for example, don't come to consensus with the nodes in the network on the proof of work side, then that computational energy that I've put forth is lost. And so I'm incentivized thus to provide something that's very hard to spoof, which is computational cycles towards the network and come to consensus in that way. So it allows many disparate parties to come to consensus, which is kind of one of the primary facets of functional public blockchains. On the other side, we have proof of stake, which has gained a lot of popularity, mainly in projects like Ethereum, trying to move towards that kind of very, very, very hot topic in the news. And this is simply taking the monetary energy of whatever native token or coin and basically saying, I'm staking that, I'm putting that forth as my input into the network. And if I don't come to consensus, then you have the right to take that. So it's just two different consensus mechanisms. Obviously, the main difference here is that one of them basically has physical hardware that is running. So it incurs some sort of electrical cost, some sort of hardware cost. And the other one is, generally speaking, a native token of that blockchain being staked. So only a monetary input on that way. And based on this, we can really come to conclusions as to what might be a greener path. And a lot of the news has been kind of harping on that subject, but it's a little bit more nuanced than that. So we can definitely get into that.
Absolutely. I'll just have to cite a Financial Times article that just got published like 12 hours ago. So I'll have to read it from the paper. It says, Bitcoins alone consumes as much electricity as a medium-sized European country, says Brian Lucy from Trinity College. This is an astounding amount of electricity. It is a dirty business. It is a dirty currency. And it looks like ECB just described crypto assets as exorbitant carbon footprint. This is what we've been reading on the news lately. My question for you, Jesse, will be, what could future coins look like to make them greener?
Yeah, it's a good question. And look, we have a lot of this this media attention on the carbon footprint of Bitcoin. Again, a lot of these groups, I'll go back to what I said before in terms of the traditional banking system. They conveniently often leave out kind of the cost of fiat systems to the world, and instead harp on this idea that energy usage is inherently bad. And I'd like to push back on that a little bit with the idea that not only is energy usage not necessarily bad for the world, especially as we transition to a situation where we will inevitably probably have more EVs and we'll inevitably have more load on our grid systems and on our ISOs and our private production for energy. But also when we're looking at Bitcoin, like, we have to understand that not all energy is created equally. And I think that's an exceptionally hard thing to understand for people that don't really work in the intersection of energy and digital assets. And what I mean by that is, one of my friends in the industry once described this as kind of a mountaintop, right? If you have rain or you pour water on the mountaintop, it will always find its way with the path of least resistance and pool in a situation on the bottom where it can. And that's kind of the way that miners are going out into this space. So a catchy headline might say, yes, as much as Argentina, as much as a mid-sized European country. But what's really not understood is what that energy would be doing, or in another life, so to speak. A lot of the energy that's used for cryptocurrency is energy that is either hard to get at or hard to monetize for the grid. And this is fundamentally because we have the purest competition in the world, and that would be mining, right? If we think about mining as kind of a zero-sum game, we have disparate parties from all over the world that are algorithmically and economically incentivized to go and make sure that they are the most efficient in the world. And that means electricity, that means the utilization of their monetary assets to do this computational work. And one of the things they really try to drill down on, no pun intended there, is finding the lowest cost electricity. And oftentimes these are places where other industries can't or won't go. So there's this idea of curtailment. There's this idea of wasted cycles. There's ideas where, you've got transmission lines that are going to be very expensive to put up. for the grid, and also lose kind of electrical capacity over time. So they need to be stepped up again. Bitcoin mining and proof of work mining in general is kind of what I would like to call a composable demand. And so what that really means is that it can go to the source and soak up underutilized energy. A really good example of this is in 2018, I did some calculations, and this was around this time in May, in fact, when I spoke about this, that California every day with just their solar produces enough electricity to power Boston, where I'm from, it's my hometown, and it's wasted. And what that means is it's curtailed. So the grid either can't or won't use it, or will pay significantly less for it. And so in many ways, the problem is not energy usage, as I've mentioned, it's the transmission of energy, and it's the monetization of energy for these greener kind of these greener cycles, right? So really, it's really interesting to look at that in a different light. All that said, right, we are not at a fully renewable grid yet. In fact, there's a heavy amount of use of what I would call a carbon battery, right, which is generally used to ramp up demand. It takes a lot more energy or basically space to do a gigantic 100 megawatt solar field than it would to do something like a natural gas fired power plant. And those can generally be a smaller footprint and thus located closer to population centers and ramp up more quickly. And so storage is an issue, and demand is an issue, and so we're not there yet. And so when we talk about what a future and a greener coin could look like, oftentimes the media, in some ways rightfully so, harps on this idea of proof of stake. But there are trade-offs, and so it's really interesting to look towards where Bitcoin could go, where other cryptos could go, and see kind of hybrid consensus mechanisms, the rise of tokens and blockchains that are not necessarily public and distributed, as a way to potentially lower the system's costs, so to speak, and the energy costs for running them. But overall, I think it's really important to push back on this narrative of energy use as bad, because in fact, we need more energy in this world, especially as we transition to renewables, and we need a way to incentivize more renewables to be created. And I believe that that it was not by accident, but in fact by design, that Satoshi designed this to be relatively computationally and thus electrically intense to run Bitcoin. So I hope that's a good enough answer there in terms of the way that a lot of us see it when we're going out and we're doing these very large developments for current coins. It's not by accident; it is by design.
Interesting.
That is really interesting. And I think that kind of leads on from, obviously, anyone that's involved in the space, anyone that's involved in mining, they're doing it, to make a profit. It's not just something that you do on the side. There's an incentive there to do it. And to make money, you need to be efficient. So is mining in its current form efficient, or perhaps what should miners be doing, or what are they doing to make sure they are as efficient as possible?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and probably my main driver beyond wanting to see a greener planet in this world is I think that mining is potentially the coolest kind of combination of kind of the like a global supercomputer, compute resources, the meta market, and and economics in a very interesting way. I don't know another system out there in the world that purely based on algorithmic means can incentivize hundreds of thousands of disparate parties all around the world to self-upgrade their systems in order to compete. A normal data center generally is on a 2, 3, maybe 5-year upgrade cycle. Bitcoin miners and proof of work miners in general are on an upgrade cycle that is necessitated by the network. And so when we look at this in my mind as the purest form of competition that is out there on the planet, we come to what I've said before, which is this pie, right? It's a zero-sum game, meaning that we have one pie for everyone to take their slice of. If it's the same thing with like buying one lottery ticket or buying 10,000. I have a higher chance of winning. And the pooling side, which I work at, smooths this kind of winning idea out. But overall, people and miners thus are incentivized to build more and more and more computational power and which not only upgrades the network's capacity, but also the security of the network, which is really, I think, very interesting. But when we're looking at mining as this zero-sum game, right, it is absolutely necessary that they go towards the cheapest electricity over time, right? There may be cyclical market cycles that would allow them to use older hardware or run on higher priced electricity, but the most efficient miners can survive the ups and downs, as we've seen. Even in very recent news, the most efficient miners are going to be able to operate at a scale which is very hard to compete with, and that fundamentally is a trend towards zero. What I mean by a trend towards zero is that your price of your hardware needs to continue going down. So when you order in bulk, that's economies of scale. Your price of electricity needs to keep going down. And as we go farther and farther, and this is happening right now, as we go lower and lower in electricity, there is really only one path forward, and you can see this on a global level, which is renewables, and that is fundamentally because there is no input cost in terms of the fuel. So when we look at this as the purest form of competition, 10 years from now, 5 years from now, I don't know, aside from fringe use cases such as, which are also kind of renewable in their own light, such as flare gas and like gas mitigation that would otherwise be flared. This is being utilized for Bitcoin. I don't think there'll be a single miner in 10 years that is not operating on renewables, simply because of the input cost, right? You can have the sun, the wind, or the water, which is a free input cost, and all you have to do is build the infrastructure around it, or you can be paying for the fuel. And so what ends up happening, we've already seen this in China. We've already seen this in the United States in terms of where miners self-locate themselves. China, there's a vast majority of it that is done on hydro dams, right? In the United States, there's a ton of it done on grid-powered mining, but a lot of that is in Texas, where there happens to be the largest wind farms out there. So we're already seeing this in real time. And a good estimate from Cambridge Bitcoin Energy Index, I think the last time they published, and I believe they're coming out with a new publication here, is that 76% of miners were using some sort of renewable energy. And that is not because fundamentally, I'm sure there's a moral side of it that we all want to be in a healthier, greener planet, but that is making money. You know what I mean? That is 100% towards, this is cheaper to do over time. This is cheaper to do right now. So I only expect that number to go up, and I expect a complete switch into renewables in scale within the next 5 to 10 years, probably.
Right. No, that's super interesting. If you were advising someone right now, where would you tell them to be in this moment?
It depends on a variety of factors. The company I was leading with my co-founder before this was designed to help place people and help do the data analytics for where you could do proof of work mining. We see hotspots pop up everywhere, but generally, if there is a kind of overarching theme to a place being better for mining, whether that's a mix of energy cost, regulatory concerns, import-export stuff. We're seeing a lot of it done in Texas, as I mentioned, in the United States, based on kind of the ERCOT system. We're seeing a lot of it done in upstate New York, based on hydro and ISOs up there, and kind of converting, in some senses, peaker plants or other underutilized energy assets. We're seeing it done in China on a lot of hydro. also in the CIS region, on hydro and other fuel sources. So there's these mining epicenters that pop up around the world. I can't give a good, it's such a broad question as to where people have their connections and where people want to go. But those are kind of some of the bigger sites that we're seeing right now. Washington State is another one. And again, this is generally speaking, if you look at all of these, what they have in common, it is power and scale, and more often than not, renewable power and scale. And obviously the jurisdictions there are more friendly to crypto generally if it's going to be a large deployment.
All right. So my next question will be more about the concerns that some might have. I'll ask if there are any ethical concerns in a decentralized system, and how does one know where the cons are from?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, the beginnings of something like Bitcoin, and in many cases, a lot of technology comes from fringe groups and fringe use cases and other areas, where essentially it's a little bit outside of the mainstream. I think, as we've seen, especially in the last week, I think we're moving into a real mainstream adoption of cryptocurrency in general. It's not only something that a couple of years ago I was kind of a weirdo for owning it, for talking about it, and for working full time in it. And now almost all of my friends, whether it was me pushing them to do it or them, just adding it to their investment portfolios, own some sort of crypto, be it through something like Robinhood or PayPal, or be it through an exchange, or through peer-to-peer transactions. So it's definitely reaching the mainstream now. I think that's very apparent also when you look at Fortune 500 companies and the trend towards institutional adoption this year, both on the actual asset side as well as the mining of the asset side. But overall, we're moving towards, I think, a decentralized system, yes, but also a more regulated system, which I think is in general better for the world. Yeah. We need to make sure that this is a healthy addition to the world and not something that is overwhelmingly used nefariously. And I think we can already, via the data, understand and prove that as the case. I will say that compliance, KYC, AML is something that we strive to do very seriously at Binance. We're some of the leaders in that space. And it's, there's a lot of scrutiny on who is using and how they're using our systems. And I think that's a trend throughout the crypto environment. So I think it's only becoming more mainstream. And while it's also becoming more decentralized as more disparate parties around the world begin to adopt it, begin to use it in their daily lives, it's also becoming something that is more legitimate. And so I guess that's kind of my, so on an ethical standpoint, I think it's only becoming better. And that's something that, really gets me jazzed in the morning. So.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, to bring it back to what we're about as future of money, what is your vision for the future? And I think it probably brings it back to what you said at the start in terms of how this could actually drive that ecological change that we need. It's not a detriment to seeing a green revolution. It's in fact driving that. I mean, what do you see this looking like in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? What is the future?
Yeah, so overwhelmingly, if I were to vanish from the earth tomorrow, what I would want my legacy to be fundamentally is in talking about moving forward and working towards a completely green environment, environmentally, conscious world. I'm a huge gardener outside of my my Bitcoin side, my crypto side. Basically every day when I shut off the computer, I go outside and I work with plants. And I really find that kind of very rewarding and very, calming in a way. I want a more sustainable planet. I want to see more people have access to systems that can better their lives. And so a lot of what we've talked about here is my ultimate driver when I wake up in the morning. I work with people from around the world, and I can see firsthand what cryptocurrency is doing to benefit those people. I think fundamentally we need to bank the unbanked. We need to create access, and we need to create ethical and environmentally conscious access. And so, yeah, what we're talking about here is exactly what I would want to see from the world in 5 to 10 years. I also would really like to see situations where people have an exit ramp in the case of either failure or economic downturn. I think it's always important to have some sort of system that is outside for, to hold one's economic value outside of their government. As I see increasingly, that is kind of I think a need for the world in a broader sense. And so, pretty simply, right, I want to see mining reach the mainstream. I think hash rate or computational energy will be basically a commodity at some point. And I think that that's really, a thriving ecosystem around that, I think, is really important for the world. I want to see more money going into renewable energy projects through and on the back of mining, whatever coin it may be. And then I want to see access and custody solutions and basically ease of use proliferated around the world for people to engage in sound money. I think one of the most striking things to me is that Edison, almost 100 years ago, talked about energy-backed money. And as we look towards, kind of some of the inflation that may be going on, and a lot of the stimulus that was done for, moving out of this kind of coronavirus world, it's really important that I think we have something to grasp onto that is promoting savings and promoting financial freedom for people. And I think that betters the lives of everyone. And if we can do that on the back of also making the planet greener, then I hope, in 10, 20, 30 years, I can still be gardening outside. So that's my driver.
That's great. Thanks for that. Just quickly picking up on something you said there about Edison and the idea of an energy-backed currency. Do you think that's something that, gives a tangibility to cryptocurrencies that perhaps people haven't been able to, when, people that aren't involved in the space look at it and they say, well, what is it? It's a number on a screen. Like, how is this really worth anything? Is that the idea that gives it a value, the idea that it's got an energy backing?
Yeah, I mean, this is why I'm such a proof of work nut in a way, is because I think that there's a lot of value overall in the crypto space, but there's an input cost fundamentally. There's kind of a predictable system that exists around proof of work that, in my mind, gives it value. I don't look at Bitcoin as another currency just in its own right. I look at it as basically a battery, an economic battery, and a storage of the value of electrons at that time. So, for example, an interesting idea here is, let's say I have a production facility that's way out there. It may cost me $1 million a mile to transport that energy via 13/8 lines, like grid tied lines up top. And that requires maintenance and all of that. Or I could, pull up a 40-foot shipping container full of ASIC, so application specific integrated circuit, Bitcoin miners, or some other sort of proof of work miner directly to the source, and essentially store the value of the electrons created by that provider in Bitcoin. And I think that fundamentally gives Bitcoin and other cryptos that are on this proof of work system, especially those that have hard caps such as 21 million like Bitcoin, real value. It's a battery. It is, in many ways, it is a composable demand. You can bring it to the source. And so, yeah, that, it also brings in real input costs, which I think is something that does give it value. Meaning what you're really looking at is your cost of electricity, and then your cost of the machines to utilize the electricity amortized over the functional lifespan of them makes your production price of Bitcoin. Your market price minus your production price is your delta, and that's where your profit is. And so if you think about this competition that we've talked about here, right, you always want your production price to be lower than the market price. That's how you make money as a miner. But there is, in my mind, maybe not very tangible, but at least some sort of floor where the most efficient miner has to be, which does give it kind of a backing of value. And so, yeah, that's really important to me to see that as a driver. And fundamentally, we see a lot of the inflow of money into something what I would, increasingly say is digital gold, or this digitally scarce narrative, which is Bitcoin, and then out into the broader crypto ecosystem. So an on-ramp and then proliferation, moving the space forward. So, yeah.
Okay, great. Well, while we've been talking, there's been some questions coming in on the chat, which Ian has been keeping track of. So, Ian, would you like to take it away with the Q&A session?
Oh, yeah, I'll just connect the camera. Here we go. Yeah, hi. So I think the first question, which really springs out at me, is what happens when the maximum number of Bitcoins is reached and have been mined? What happens to energy then? Can we predict that?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and it's a more pertinent question than I think people give credit, right? The estimate is like by 2140 that the last Bitcoin will be mined, so to speak. But in reality, you're looking at a much more accelerated time frame due to predictable and algorithmically programmed halving events, right? So it's at roughly every 4 years. And so when we're looking at kind of what happens at that point, it's important to go back to the numbers, and I'm privileged again to have kind of a vision of this because I work for and at a pool with an awesome team that also, really has an interesting mindset towards providing value to the end user, which is our miners. Basically, Bitcoin is designed so that at a certain point, there will be no more of what we call a block reward. So if we go back to kind of the fundamentals of proof of work mining and Bitcoin mining, you need to incentivize disparate parties to run these computer hardwares. Now, this computer hardware costs energy, and it also costs money to produce, and then to buy and to utilize, and to upkeep. And so what Satoshi basically envisioned is this idea of a block reward. So roughly every 10 minutes, essentially at this point, 6.25 Bitcoin more or less drops down onto the network, and that's the reward for all miners out there. Without this, we would just be participating on the TX fees or the transaction fees. And that's an important thing to understand, is that eventually the design of Bitcoin and many other proof of work cryptocurrencies is that they are just based on the transaction fees. So it looks actually more like something like PayPal, Visa, MasterCard that makes their money on the transaction fees. Now, as we know, Bitcoin is fundamentally, almost always cheaper to transact with than any of those other payment processors. I mean, you can send $1 billion or you can send $10 for roughly the same price right now. And if you want to cut the line a little bit, you could put a little bit more on that transaction, but you could send it for a cent. Theoretically, it would eventually go through. And so when we're looking at what actually happens at that point, the idea is with digital scarcity and these halving events that eventually the block reward is no longer needed. The underlying price of Bitcoin, because it's scarce, goes up, and then miners are able to continue basically operating without that block reward, and so only on those transaction fees. So it's a self-contained, in many ways, what I consider an upgrade to the network, and something that can continue proliferating on indefinitely on the back of TX fees. And so that's also why I'm so interested in seeing the effects of these halving periods on Bitcoin, is because, like, by design, it is supposed to essentially go up in price to account for that as well. So it's yet to be seen what that will do, but it definitely makes me positive on the outlook of Bitcoin and the broader cryptocurrency.
So if the future is relying on TX fees, presumably there needs to be a minimum volume of transactions going on at any one time for people to want to continue in that system, yeah?
Yes. But we're already seeing, right, we're already seeing kind of the what I would consider full utilization. And in fact, the need for second layer solutions on top to proliferate more transactions on the Bitcoin network, as well as, other cryptocurrencies and their blockchains offloading some of that transaction volume as well. So I don't think it will be, as it comes into its own, I don't think that Bitcoin or crypto in general will have a problem with use. In fact, what we're seeing right now is a race in many ways to scale these systems so they can onboard more of the world's monetary energy.
Okay. So we've got another question, and this is a broader question around blockchain, and when the world moves to a situation where things like logistics, contracts, all these kind of things linked through 5G and the Internet of Things are using blockchain to underpin them. What happens then to energy consumption, and how can we compare that to legacy systems that we're using today that perhaps consume energy in another way?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I think that overall we're moving towards more efficient systems when it comes to blockchains in general. I think that overall traceability and basically public ledgers are the way forward in terms of tracing either physical objects or information through space and time. And so I think one of the things I'm really excited for is also more information traveling with items and or transactions in real space. And I think that cuts down on things like factory recalls, which are incredibly costly for both the manufacturer, but also can have real world consequences on the user. And then, and all of the energy that is used during that supply chain. So a good example would be something like if I have an auto part and I have better traceability through the stack, so to speak, then instead of recalling 20,000 of these items and paying for the carbon emissions going there and back, I can say, actually, we know that this problem occurred between X time here and X time here at X factory. We're only going to recall the 1,000. And so overall, I see a lot better traceability as a net positive for the world. But it's a really interesting question, and I honestly haven't gone too much deeper than that in terms of my understanding, or kind of like diving down the rabbit hole a little bit. I guess the last thing I will say is also we're seeing now proliferations of certain blockchains that also are more niche in nature and allow and use the idea of rewarding many disparate parties, as has been proven to be very valuable on proof of work, to actually incentivize infrastructure build out. And a really good example of this, for example, is like the Helium project, where it sits in this niche of needing kind of a network for Internet of Things and small bits of data. And so rather than spending a gross amount of money and proliferating this all across the world, you can decentralize it, have the user pay for the actual systems and then uphold them themselves. And so I see a world where, that's just one, small example. There are many, many other projects that are doing great things as well. I'm just giving one that I think is relatively interesting. But those kind of things where we can offload some of these systems to the end user and incentivize them to run these systems, I think is also better for traceability and all of that throughout the stack as well.
Well, another question we've had through is about the attitude of different countries and different governments. We've seen what's happened with China over the last few days. How do you think, and also India, of course, recently, how do you think that the attitude of governments and the kinds of legislation that they pass will impact the crypto space? Are we going to push more people to go into crypto because they're worried about keeping their money away from the government, or are we going to see perhaps less people being interested because they're worried that the government will control everything, and in the end they lose control of their assets?
It's a hard question for me to answer. I don't have a crystal ball. And, you know, I work more on the tech side than the geopolitical side. What I will say is, at the end of the day, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel in a way. We're fundamentally trying to provide a second option to people. So I would say the value is in creating that option, proliferating the option, and also, you know, doubling down on our efforts to make that more accessible. And however the world views it and basically adopts it, will be their choice. But I will say that I think that the option in and of itself is valuable, and real people will decide what they want to do with their time, with their money, with their own energy. And I think that providing that option, either with governments or outside governments, is the highest calling for a lot of us that work in the crypto space. So I don't have a crystal ball, but I will say that, you know, that this is impacting real people's lives, and it's really important to continue the work regardless of what governments say about what's happening here.
Yeah. Okay, great. And we've got another sort of more technical question about glitches on trading platforms, but maybe we'll keep that back and ask you that in written format a later time.
Yeah.
Okay. If anybody else has got any questions, then, you know, please do send them through in the next minute or so. Thank you ever so much, Jesse, for coming on. It's been really fascinating, and thanks for all the work you've done as well in the build up to the events. It's been really interesting talking to you. I'll just hand back to George and to Alex, and like I say, if there are any other questions that come in the next few minutes, we'll send them through to you, Jesse.
Sure.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you everyone for joining. Definitely thank you, Jesse. It's so interesting to hear from someone that's actually in the space, because we talk about it all the time between ourselves, and all these questions come up and no one really knows how to answer them. So to speak to someone that can give us more of an insight is absolutely brilliant, and we really, really appreciate you joining us today. But thank you to all the team as well. Thank you, Alex, for co-hosting. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Wen. Thank you, Adam, who do all the stuff behind the scenes, who keep the social media going. Speaking of which, if you're not following us already, go and follow us on everything you can. If you found us on something, but the links to other platforms are also there. All of our events are, of course, on YouTube live, but also on YouTube forever. So share it with friends, share it with family. And yeah, let's keep trying to shed light on some of the things that we all want to know a little bit more about. Our event next month is on something completely different. It's on the CFA franc, which is a currency in West and Central Africa. And it's something that I've spent a lot of time looking at as a student, but something that generally people, in my opinion, don't know as much about as they should. So we're going to dig down into that and look at what it means for the people that use it, and perhaps what the future of the currency will be in West and Central Africa. So that will be on the 22nd of June, but there'll be loads of information going out on our social media about that. So yeah, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you, everyone, and look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, George.
Bye.
Thank you, Ian. It's been a pleasure and an honor to be here. So I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Jesse.